Imagine a world where everything that happens is planned and controlled by a single, all-powerful being. This being, who is also all good, decides every action, every thought, and every event. Sounds like a comforting idea, right? A world where nothing bad could happen without a good reason. But what if this all-powerful being also decides that some people will suffer, that some will sin, and that some will be condemned to eternal punishment? This is the world of Calvinism, and it's a world that raises some of the most challenging questions about evil and suffering. Calvinism, named after the 16th century theologian John Calvin, is a branch of Christianity that emphasizes God's sovereignty and predestination. According to Calvinists, God has a detailed plan for everything that happens, and nothing occurs outside of His will. This means that every good deed, every act of kindness, and every moment of joy is part of God's plan. But it also means that every act of cruelty, every moment of suffering, and every sin is part of God's plan too. This idea might seem strange, even disturbing. How can an all-good God be responsible for evil? How can a loving God allow people to suffer and sin, knowing the consequences? These questions are at the heart of what philosophers and theologians call the problem of evil. For Calvinists, this problem is particularly acute because their view of God's sovereignty seems to make God more directly responsible for evil than in other Christian traditions. Let's dive into the heart of the matter. Imagine you're in a room with a group of people, and one of them is about to commit a terrible act. You have the power to stop them, but you choose not to. In a sense, you are responsible for what happens. Now, imagine that you not only choose not to stop them, but also decide that they will commit the act. That's a step further, isn't it? This is the kind of responsibility that some people think Calvinism ascribes to God. The problem of evil for Calvinists can be broken down into a few key issues. One of the most pressing is the idea that God is the author of sin. This doesn't mean that God sins, but it does mean that God is intimately involved in the process of sin. Some argue that if God decides everything, then He must also decide when and how people sin. This raises the question, can an all-good God be the one who decides that people will sin? Another issue is the problem of the first sin. According to Christian doctrine, the first sin was committed by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. If God is all-powerful and all-knowing, He knew that Adam and Eve would sin. Some even argue that God created Adam and Eve in such a way that they would sin. This leads to the question, why would an all-good God create beings who He knew would sin and bring suffering into the world? Finally, there's the ordinary problem of evil, which is about the amount of suffering and evil in the world. If God is all good and all-powerful, why is there so much pain and suffering? Calvinists have to explain why God, who has the power to prevent evil, allows it to happen. They often argue that there is a greater good that comes from evil, but this can be a hard sell, especially when you're facing the reality of innocent people suffering. These questions are not just theoretical, they have real-world implications. For example, if God has a plan for everything, does that mean that the suffering of a child with a terminal illness is part of that plan? If so, how can we reconcile that with the idea of a loving God? These are the kinds of questions that keep philosophers and theologians up at night. In the chapters that follow, we'll explore these issues in depth. We'll look at the arguments for and against the idea that God is the author of sin, the problem of the first sin, and the ordinary problem of evil. We'll also consider how Calvinists have responded to these challenges and what they believe about God's role in the world. But for now, let's sit with the shock of it all. The idea that an all-good God is responsible for evil is a difficult one to swallow. It challenges our understanding of God, of morality, and of the world we live in. But it's a challenge worth facing, because the answers we find can help us make sense of the world and our place in it. When it comes to the idea that God might be the author of sin, there are different ways to think about it, and each way needs its own answer. This is because the charge can be broken down into at least 4 different arguments, and each one requires a different kind of response. Let's look at these responses and how they work. First, some people say that Calvinism, a branch of Christian belief, means that God causes sin and evil. Others say it means that God intends for sin and evil to happen. These are related, but not the same. Some writers, like Greg Welty, argue that if Calvinism means God causes sin, then other Christian views, like Molinism, also mean God causes sin. So, if it's a problem for Calvinism, it's a problem for other Christian views too. This is called a tu quoque strategy, which means you too. Heath White, another writer, separates these two ideas. He says that even if God determines everything, which is what theological determinism means, it doesn't mean God causes or intends evil. He explains that evil isn't a thing that God can cause. It's more like a lack of something good. So God can't cause a lack of good. Also, when God creates the world, He only intends the good things, not the bad things, even if the bad things happen. David Alexander and Daniel Johnson take a different approach. They say that even if Calvinism means God causes and intends sin, it doesn't mean it's wrong for God to do so. They argue that the way God acts is very different from how humans act. For example, God is the source of all goodness and wisdom, so He might have the right to direct the world in ways that humans don't. They also say that God's actions are so different from human actions that we shouldn't judge them the same way. James Bruce looks at an older view from a theologian named Francis Turretin. Turretin said that God's actions are in a different category from human actions. God can direct the world in a way that humans can't, and this means that even if God causes sin, it's not the same as a human causing sin. Bruce also says that God can intend actions without intending the evil in those actions, because evil is a lack of good, not a thing in itself. James Anderson and Paul Helm add that we should be humble about our understanding of God's actions. They say that God's way of ensuring that things happen is very different from how humans cause things to happen, and we should be careful about judging God's actions based on our limited understanding. Another version of the author of sin charge is that Calvinism means God desires sin and evil. The usual response is to say that God has different kinds of desires. One kind is His sovereign will, where He decides what happens. The other kind is His preceptive will, where He tells us what we should do. This means that God can desire something to happen without desiring the evil in it. Paul Helm talks about God's love. He says that the idea that a perfect being would love everyone equally is not correct. God does love everyone, but not in the same way. David Alexander uses the idea that evil is a lack of good to argue that God does love everyone, even those in hell, by sustaining them in existence. Daniel Johnson gives an example of a general who loves his son but sends him to defend a city, knowing he might die. This shows that love can involve desiring the good of someone, but that good can sometimes be overridden by a greater good. So if there is a greater good that comes from some people being lost, then God's not loving them in the same way doesn't mean He doesn't love them at all. Finally, there's the problem of the first sin. According to Christian teaching, sin entered the world through the actions of beings who were not sinful before. This is a puzzle for Calvinism, which says that everything is determined. Alexander Pruss explains that there are two ways to think about this: the Thomist view, which allows for some freedom in actions, and the Edwardsian view, which says everything is determined. The Thomist view handles the first sin well, but has problems with the author of sin charge. The Edwardsian view handles the author of sin charge well, but has problems with the first sin. So, the way you answer one problem affects how you answer the other. These different responses show that the author of sin charge is complex, and there are many ways to think about it. Each response helps us understand a different part of the problem and how Calvinists might answer it. James Anderson, in Chapter 9, tackles some deep questions about sin, free will, and God's role in the world. He starts by looking at the author of sin objection, which asks whether God can be blamed for sin if he determines everything that happens. Anderson also explores philosophical challenges to the idea that free will can coexist with God's control, compatibilism, and the weaknesses of non-Calvinist views on how God manages the world, providence. One of Anderson's main points is about Adam's first sin. He draws on the work of Alfred Male, who talks about weakness of will, acrasia. Male says that sometimes we do things that we know are wrong because our desires are stronger than our evaluations. For example, you might eat a whole cake even though you know it's not good for you. Anderson suggests that Adam's first sin might have been like this. Adam wasn't inherently bad, but his desires and evaluations were mismatched, leading him to sin. This doesn't mean Adam was weak-willed in general. It just means that in that moment his desires overpowered his better judgment. Anderson argues that this kind of decision can still be considered free, even if it was determined by Adam's character and environment. Anderson also responds to those who believe in libertarian free will, which is the idea that our actions are not determined by anything. He points out that if free actions are genuinely undetermined, they can seem random or mysterious. This randomness is just as problematic as the Calvinist idea that God determines everything. Both views have to deal with some level of mystery. When it comes to the problem of evil, many people use the free will defense to explain why God allows evil. They say that free will is valuable and that evil is a necessary part of having free will. However, Calvinists, who believe that God determines everything, can't use this defense. They can still think that free will is valuable, but they can't say that God allows evil to preserve free will, because God could determine that people act freely and righteously. Instead, Calvinists can use other defenses. For example, the soul-making defense says that evil helps people grow and become better. Another defense, proposed by Daniel Johnson, focuses on the value of divine glory. Johnson argues that God allows evil to demonstrate his character and to help people appreciate and understand him better. He says that even if God could directly implant this understanding in our minds, there's added value in seeing God's responses to actual evil. Matthew Hart takes this idea further by looking at the problem of hell. He argues that the existence of hell helps people understand important truths about God, such as his justice and mercy. Even if God could just tell us about these attributes, the actual experience of seeing God's responses to evil is more valuable. Another aspect of divine glory, according to Johnson, is the exercise of God's powers. God can't show his love without forgiveness, and he can't show his justice without judging wrongdoers. The actual expression of these attributes is valuable, and might be enough to outweigh the badness of evil in the world. Skeptical theism is another defense that Calvinists can use. It suggests that even if we can't understand why God allows evil, it doesn't mean there isn't a good reason. This defense is effective against both the logical and evidential problems of evil, because both involve evidence and reasoning. Finally, the Moore switch is a unique approach that suggests that some people can directly perceive God's existence. Even if evil seems to count against God's existence, this direct perception can outweigh the evidence of evil. This idea is related to the Reformed epistemology movement, which argues that belief in God can be basic and foundational, like the belief that we have hands. These different defenses and approaches show that Calvinists have a variety of ways to address the problem of evil. They don't have to accept that God is the author of sin in a problematic way, and they can still explain why evil exists in a world created by a good and powerful God. When it comes to the big questions in life, like why bad things happen, Calvinism, a branch of Christianity, has its own unique way of looking at things. But this view also faces some tough questions, especially about evil. Let's dive into how Calvinism handles these challenges. Calvinism is named after John Calvin, a theologian from the 16th century. It has two main parts: Calvinist soteriology, the theory of salvation, and Calvinist determinism, the idea that God controls everything. Calvinist soteriology is all about how people can be saved. According to this view, total depravity. Humans are so fallen and opposed to God that they can't turn to Him on their own. Unconditional election. God chooses who will be saved, not based on anything good or bad about them, but just because He wants to. Limited atonement. Jesus died to save only those God has chosen. Irresistible grace. When God chooses to save someone, they can't resist His power. Perseverance of the saints. Once saved, people will always stay saved, because God's power ensures it. Calvinist determinism is the idea that God has planned everything that happens. This means God is in control of everything, from the smallest detail to the biggest events. Even though God controls everything, humans are still responsible for their actions. The problem of evil is a big challenge for all religions, including Calvinism. If God is all good and all powerful, why is there evil in the world? For Calvinists, this problem is even trickier because of their belief in determinism. Here's why. One of the biggest concerns is that Calvinism might make God responsible for sin. If God controls everything and evil happens, doesn't that mean God is the one causing evil? Calvinists have several ways to respond to this. God's sovereignty and human responsibility. Calvinists believe that God's control doesn't take away human responsibility. Humans are still free to choose, even if God knows what they will choose. This is a bit like a parent knowing their child will make a mistake, but letting them learn from it. Different kinds of causation. Some Calvinists, like Hugh McCann, suggest that God's causation is different from the way things happen in the natural world. God's actions don't force humans to sin. Instead, they guide the world in a way that allows for free choices. This is like a writer who plans the plot of a story but lets the characters make their own decisions within that plot. Moral responsibility without free will. Some Calvinists, like John Martin Fisher, argue that free will isn't necessary for moral responsibility. Even if humans can't choose otherwise, they can still be held responsible for their actions. This is like a person who is under the influence of a drug, but still responsible for the bad things they do while under the influence. Another way Calvinists address the problem of evil is through the idea of divine glory. This means that God allows evil to happen because it ultimately leads to a greater good, His own glory. Alvin Plantinga and Stephen Wickstra are two philosophers who have explored this idea. They suggest that even if we can't see the good that comes from evil, it doesn't mean there isn't one. Supralapsarianism is a theological view that God planned sin from the beginning to show His glory. This is a bit like a painter who uses dark colors to make the light colors stand out more. The Reformed tradition, which includes Calvinism, has a long history of thinking about evil. There are many concepts and ideas that can help explain why evil exists and how it fits into God's plan. Francis Turretin and other Reformed thinkers have written a lot about how Calvinism can handle the problem of evil. James Bruce and James Anderson have also contributed to this discussion, showing that Calvinism has resources to deal with these challenges. Calvinism faces unique challenges when it comes to the problem of evil, but it also has a rich tradition and many thoughtful responses. Whether through the idea of different kinds of causation, the concept of moral responsibility without free will, or the divine glory defense, Calvinists have ways to explain why evil exists and how it fits into God's plan. The idea that God controls everything, even the bad things that happen, is a central part of Calvinist thinking. This belief raises a big question. If God is in control of everything, does that mean He is responsible for evil and sin? This is a tricky issue, and it has several layers to it. One of the main concerns is whether God intentionally causes evil. According to Calvinism, God plans and brings about everything that happens, including the evil actions of people. Some people argue that if God intentionally causes evil, then He must be doing something wrong. After all, if a person intentionally makes someone else do something bad, we would say that person is doing wrong. So, if God does this, doesn't that mean God is doing wrong? This seems impossible because God is supposed to be perfectly good. To understand this better, let's look at a few different angles. When we think about human actions, we often say that it's wrong to make someone else do something evil, even if we have a good reason. For example, if someone tricks a friend into stealing, we would say the trickster is wrong. But is it the same for God? Calvinists argue that God is different from humans in important ways. God is the ruler of the universe, the source of all goodness, and He has no external laws to follow. Humans, on the other hand, are subject to God's laws and can act rebelliously. Because of these differences, God's actions in bringing about evil might not be wrong in the same way that human actions are. Another way to look at this is through the idea of God's sovereignty. Calvinists believe that God has the right to direct the destinies of human beings in ways that we don't have the right to do to each other. For example, in the story of Joseph from the Bible, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery, which was a terrible thing. But later, Joseph says, "You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good." This suggests that God intended the evil action to bring about a greater good. This doesn't mean God is doing something wrong. It means that God's intentions and actions are on a different level from ours. Calvinists often use a distinction between doing and allowing to explain how God can be involved in evil without being responsible for it. When God does something, it means He actively brings it about. When God allows something, it means He permits it to happen without directly causing it. For example, God might allow a person to make a bad choice, but He doesn't do the bad choice for them. This distinction helps to explain how God can be in control without being the one who commits the evil. Some Calvinists, like Jonathan Edwards, argue that evil is not a thing that God creates, but rather the absence of good. In this view, God sustains all good things, and when something bad happens, it's because God allows a good thing to be absent. For example, if a person chooses to lie, the lie is the absence of truth. God doesn't create the lie. He allows the truth to be absent. This helps to explain how God can be involved in evil without causing it. Another way to think about this is to consider the difference between God's power and human power. God's power is so different from ours that it's hard to compare. When God allows something, it's more like an author writing a story. The author controls everything in the story, but the characters in the story are responsible for their actions. God, in a similar way, can be in control without being responsible for the evil actions of people. The Bible provides examples that support the idea that God can be involved in evil without being responsible for it. For instance, in the story of Joseph, God is said to have intended the evil actions of Joseph's brothers for good. In the story of Pharaoh, God hardens Pharaoh's heart, but Pharaoh is still responsible for his actions. These stories show that God can use evil to bring about good, and that God's involvement in evil is different from human involvement. All of these explanations show that the relationship between God and evil is complex. God's actions and intentions are different from ours, and his involvement in evil is not the same as human involvement. While it's a challenging topic, Calvinists believe that God's sovereignty and goodness are consistent with his involvement in the world, even in the presence of evil. Understanding these different perspectives can help us see that the author of sin problem is not a simple one. It requires us to think deeply about God's nature, human, free will, and the ways in which God works in the world. The debate over Calvinism and the nature of God's actions and desires is a complex one, filled with deep theological and philosophical questions. One of the main challenges to Calvinism is the idea that if God is in control of everything, including evil, then he must be the author of sin. This chapter explores three key charges against Calvinism and how Calvinists respond to them. One of the first challenges to Calvinism is the idea that God's actions and human actions are fundamentally different. Critics argue that if God is the one who brings about evil, then he is the author of sin. Calvinists, however, have a different perspective. They suggest that the distinction between doing and allowing can be useful, but it needs to be understood in a specific way. Calvinists argue that God's actions are radically different from human actions. While humans can do things or allow things to happen, God's actions are unique. God's actions can be seen as both doing and allowing in different contexts. For example, when God allows evil to happen, it's not because he is passive, but because his actions are so complex and powerful that they can be both active and permissive at the same time. This means that when we talk about God doing something, we are highlighting his role as the source of the event. When we talk about God allowing something, we are highlighting that he is not directly responsible for the evil, even though he permits it. This way of thinking helps to maintain the idea that God is sovereign and in control, while also acknowledging that he is not the direct cause of evil. Another charge against Calvinism is that if God is in control of everything, he must desire that evil occur. This seems to contradict the idea of a loving and good God. Calvinists respond to this by distinguishing between two types of God's will: the decretive will and the preceptive will. The decretive will is what God has ordained to happen. It's his sovereign plan for the world including the allowance of evil. The perceptive will, on the other hand, is what God commands and desires in a moral sense. For example, God commands people to do good and not to sin, even though He has ordained that some will sin. This distinction helps to explain why God can desire something in one sense and not in another. For instance, God may desire that no one suffers, but He also desires a world where free will and moral choices exist. These desires can conflict, and God's decretive will is the ultimate plan that balances these conflicting desires. Think of it like a parent who wants their child to be safe, but also wants them to learn and grow through challenges. The parent may not desire the challenges, but they see the greater good in allowing them to happen. The final charge against Calvinism is that if God only saves a select few, the elect, then He doesn't truly love everyone. This seems to contradict the idea that God loves all people, as suggested in many passages of the Bible. Calvinists respond by saying that God's love can take different forms. There is a general love that God has for all people, which is why He provides for everyone and offers salvation. However, there is also a special saving love that He has for the elect. This special love is what ensures their salvation. The argument here is that God's general love for all people does not require Him to save everyone. Just as a parent can love all their children but have a special bond with one, God can love all people but have a special saving love for the elect. This doesn't mean He doesn't care about the lost. It means that there are other great goods that God is working towards, such as the ultimate glory of His name and the salvation of those He has chosen. All of these arguments ultimately tie back to the problem of evil. Why does a good and loving God allow evil to exist? Calvinists believe that God has a greater plan, and that even the existence of evil serves a purpose in His ultimate design. This doesn't mean that God is the author of sin, but it does mean that He is in control and has a reason for everything that happens. Understanding these distinctions and arguments can help us see how Calvinists navigate the complex issues of God's sovereignty, human freedom, and the nature of evil. While the debates continue, these perspectives offer a way to reconcile the deep theological questions with the teachings of the Bible. The second big challenge for Calvinism is the problem of the first sin, or the problem of sin in the garden. Calvinism explains that after the fall, humans are naturally inclined to sin, which is why it's not surprising that we sin. But what about Adam and Eve? They were created good, so why did they sin? Were they forced to sin, or did they have a choice? This question is tricky because it seems to challenge the idea that God created everything good. On one hand, if Adam and Eve were forced to sin, it would mean they had a flaw from the start, which doesn't fit with the idea that creation was perfect. On the other hand, if they had a choice, it would mean they had the kind of free will that Calvinists usually deny. This is a real problem for Calvinists, but it's also a problem for those who believe in free will, libertarians. Libertarians have their own issues. They struggle to explain why all humans after the fall are naturally sinful and why people in heaven can't sin. If free will is so important, why can't we choose to be perfect? And why can't we choose to sin in heaven? So, both sides have their puzzles to solve. Calvinists have a few ways to tackle the problem of the first sin. One idea is that a good nature can still lead to sin when faced with a specific situation. For example, Adam and Eve were good, but the temptation in the garden was so strong that it caused them to sin. This doesn't mean they were bad, it just means they were young and not fully mature, This idea fits with the Calvinist view that even if our actions are determined, we can still be responsible for them. Another idea is that Adam and Eve's characters might have changed over time, even before they sinned. Maybe they started to develop some flaws, even though they were created good. This could explain why they were tempted and eventually sinned. A third idea is that God, in His sovereignty, determined that Adam and Eve would sin, but this doesn't cancel their responsibility. This view says that God's actions don't take away our moral responsibility, even if He determines what we do. Lastly, some Calvinists, like Augustine, suggest that Adam and Eve had the kind of free will that libertarians talk about, but only before the fall. After the fall, humans lost this free will and became naturally inclined to sin. In heaven, we will regain a kind of free will, but it will be a perfect, sinless free will. This view helps explain both the first sin and the nature of humans after the fall and in heaven. The common problem of evil is a big question for all religious beliefs. If God is all good and all-powerful, why is there evil in the world? If God is all good, He would want to stop evil, and if He is all-powerful, He could stop it so. Why doesn't He? There are two main ways to look at this problem: the logical problem and the evidential problem. The logical problem says that it's impossible for an all-good, all-powerful God to coexist with evil. The evidential problem says that the amount of evil we see in the world makes it unlikely that such a God exists. To answer these problems, people often use two types of responses: theodicies and defenses. A theodicy tries to explain why God allows evil by pointing to a greater good that justifies it. A defense just tries to show that it's possible for God to have a good reason for allowing evil, even if we don't know what it is. There are four main strategies to answer the problem of evil. Show that it's possible for God to have a good reason for allowing evil. Show that there's no evidence against the possibility of God having a good reason for allowing evil. Show that God actually has a good reason for allowing evil. Show that there's no evidence against God actually having a good reason for allowing evil. The fourth strategy is the weakest, but also the most useful. It doesn't need to prove that God has a good reason. It just needs to show that we don't have enough evidence to say He doesn't. This strategy can work for both the logical and evidential problems of evil. Calvinism faces a unique challenge because it doesn't accept the idea of libertarian free will. However, there are still ways Calvinists can respond to the problem of evil. Here are three main defenses. The divine glory defense. This defense says that God allows evil to show His glory. In the Bible, especially in Romans 9, Paul suggests that God uses evil to display His power, justice, and mercy. For example, God's forgiveness of sin shows His mercy, and His punishment of sin shows His justice. These qualities are part of God's glory, and they can't be fully shown without the existence of evil. So, the evil in the world helps reveal God's greatness. The mystery defense, skeptical theism. This defense says that we can't fully understand God's reasons for allowing evil. God's wisdom and knowledge are far beyond ours, so it's possible that He has good reasons that we just can't see. This doesn't mean we should ignore evil or stop trying to understand it, but it does mean we should be humble about our ability to judge God's actions. The Moore switch. This defense, named after philosopher G.E. Moore, suggests that we should be more skeptical about our ability to judge the existence of evil. Sometimes, what we think is evil might not be as bad as we think, or it might lead to greater goods that we can't see. This defense encourages us to be cautious about jumping to conclusions about God's actions based on our limited perspective. These defenses can work together to provide a strong response to the problem of evil. They help explain why God might allow evil, even if we can't fully understand His reasons. Calvinists can use these defenses to show that the existence of evil doesn't necessarily mean that God doesn't exist or isn't good. As we wrap up our journey through the complex idea of divine glory, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned and how it might help us understand some of the big questions in life, especially the problem of evil. We started by looking at how different thinkers like Aquinas and Jonathan Edwards understand the concept of glory. For Aquinas, glory is mostly about understanding and appreciating God's goodness. But Edwards takes it a step further, seeing glory as a whole experience that includes not just understanding but also the actions that show God's character and the response of those who witness it. This means that glory isn't just about knowing God. It's about seeing God in action and reacting to it. Edwards' idea of glory is like a three-part story. The first part is God's excellence, which is always there, even if we don't see it. The second part is when God does something amazing, like showing mercy or justice. The third part is our response, where we appreciate and understand what God has done. Each part is important, but they all work together to create a complete picture of glory. When we think about why God might allow evil, Edwards' view of glory can help us see things in a new light. One way to look at it is that God wants us to know and appreciate Him deeply. Sometimes this means experiencing His actions in response to evil. For example, seeing God's mercy in forgiving sin or His justice in righting wrongs can give us a deeper understanding of who He is. This kind of understanding and appreciation is a kind of glory. Another way to look at it is that some of God's actions, like showing mercy or justice, can only happen when there is evil. For example, God can't show mercy if there's no sin to forgive. So, in a sense, some evil might be necessary for God to fully express His character. This doesn't mean that God wants evil, but it does mean that He can use it to show His glory. Now, some people might say that this still doesn't justify the amount of evil we see in the world. They might wonder why God couldn't just tell us about His glory without letting evil happen. But the idea is that there are some kinds of knowledge and understanding that can only come from experience. Just like you can't fully understand the taste of an apple just by reading about it, you might not fully understand God's character without seeing it in action. But what if you still find it hard to accept that God would allow evil? This is where the mystery defense comes in. The idea here is that God is so much greater and wiser than we are that we might not be able to understand His reasons, just like a child might not understand why a parent makes certain decisions. We might not understand why God allows certain things to happen. This doesn't mean that God doesn't have a good reason. It just means that we might not be able to see it. Finally, even if you find the idea of divine glory or the mystery defense hard to accept, it doesn't mean you have to give up on believing in God. If you have other reasons to believe in God, like the existence of good and evil itself, those reasons might be strong enough to outweigh your doubts. In the end, faith often involves trusting that there are things beyond our understanding and that God has a plan, even if we can't see it. So, as we close this chapter, remember that the idea of divine glory helps us see that God's actions, even in the face of evil, can be a way for us to understand and appreciate Him more deeply. And if we can't fully understand why things happen, it doesn't mean that there isn't a good reason. Sometimes The best response is to trust that God has a plan, even if we can't see it yet.